Hello, my friend. Welcome back. I'm so glad you're here with me again, wherever you happen to be. It's a cool morning in England, somewhere around the year 1815. You're standing in a small parlour that smells of beeswax and cold wood smoke. There's a plain table in front of you. On it, a single sheet of paper, an inkwell, and a freshly cut quill. You dip the pen, you write your name, and in the time it takes the ink to dry, something extraordinary happens to you. You cease to exist. Not your body, of course. Your body is still here, still breathing, still warm against the morning chill, still entirely your own. But the you that the law recognized when you woke up this morning is quietly gone. The person who could own things, sign things, keep her own money, quietly, entirely gone. What surprises people most is this. Marriage in the Regency world did not join two people into a partnership of equals. In the eyes of the law, it folded one person completely into the other, and it was almost always the woman who did the disappearing. The lawyers even had a name for it. They called her a feme covert, a covered woman, covered by her husband the way a shadow is covered by the thing that casts it. Stay with me tonight, because by the time we reach the end you'll understand something that most people never quite learn. How a woman could be erased on paper and still, somehow, find room to live. If these slow journeys through history help you unwind at the end of the day, I'd love it if you subscribed and left a like. It genuinely does help. And here's something I'd love back from you. Late at night, when everything else is finally done, I sit and read the comments. The ones that stay with me longest are always the ones that tell me a place and a time. Someone in a dark bedroom at 2 a.m, someone on a sofa in a city I'll probably never visit. So tell me, if you feel like it. Where are you right now, and what time is it there? Now. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Let your shoulders come down from around your ears. Let the room go soft and quiet around you, and come back with me to a morning where a woman picks up a pen and signs herself away. So let's return to that table, to the pen, the paper, and the person about to vanish. For tonight, let's say that person is you. You've been awake since before dawn, though not by choice. There's a particular kind of stillness in a house on a wedding morning. Everyone is busy, and yet everyone is careful, as if the day itself might crack if handled too roughly. Yesterday you were what the law called a feme soul, a woman alone, in the legal sense. And here's the strange part. That version of you, the unmarried one, was powerful in ways you may never have appreciated. As a single adult woman, you could own property outright. You could buy a cottage, and it was yours. You could sign a contract, and the courts would hold both sides to it. You could earn wages and keep every penny you earned. You could take someone to court in your own name. You could even write a will and decide entirely by yourself who received your belongings after you died. None of that was remarkable to you. It was simply the water you swam in. A single woman was, in law, a whole person. And that is what makes the next part land so strangely. Because the moment your marriage is complete, nearly all of it slips through your fingers. This is the detail that stops people. It wasn't marriage that made a woman powerless in some vague general way. It was that marriage actively reduced her. The wedding was, in the coldest legal terms, a demotion. You began the day as a full legal person, and you ended it as something the law could barely see. There's a quiet irony in that, once you notice it. Every painting, every novel, every whispered piece of advice told a young woman that marriage was the great achievement of her life, the summit, the whole point. And in the eyes of the law, that summit was also the precise place where her independence went to die. Let me be careful here, because the feeling of it matters. This did not feel like a tragedy on the morning it happened. It felt like a wedding. There were flowers, probably, a good dress, brushed and pressed the night before by candlelight. People you loved, standing close. The disappearing was not loud. It wore no black. It arrived dressed as the happiest day of your life. That's what I keep coming back to. The erasure was gentle and warm and celebrated, which somehow makes it stranger, not less strange. Now, you might be picturing something dramatic, a grim official reading out your rights as they're stripped away, one by one. It was nothing like that. There was no announcement at all. That's almost the whole point. The law didn't need a ceremony to take your legal self because the taking was automatic. It happened the instant the marriage became binding, silent, invisible, complete. To understand how that could be, you have to understand a single idea that sat underneath the entire system. And it's an idea so tidy, so almost elegant, that you can see why people found it easy to believe. The idea was this: a husband and wife were not two people in law. They were one. A single legal person welded together by marriage. It sounds almost romantic when you first hear it. Two become one. You could put it on a wedding card. But listen to what it actually meant in practice, because this is where the warmth drains out of it. If a husband and wife were one legal person, then someone had to be that person. Someone's name went on the deeds. Someone made the decisions the law would recognize. Someone held the money. And it was never going to be her. So the marriage did not create a partnership of two. It created one person, and then quietly decided that person was the husband. The wife was still there. She cooked. She managed. She raised children. She ran a household that could be enormously complex. But legally she'd been absorbed. She was the covered half of a single covered whole. I want you to notice something about the word they chose. Covered. Not erased, not deleted, not destroyed. Covered. As though she was still there underneath, simply hidden from view. A signature written in pencil, and then gone over so heavily in ink that you can no longer see what was written first. The men who designed this system did not for the most part think of themselves as cruel. This is the uncomfortable thing. They thought of coverage as protection. A woman, they reasoned, should not have to trouble herself with contracts and courtrooms and the grubby business of money. Her husband would shoulder all of that. She was being shielded, sheltered, kept. You can almost hear the kindness in it, and you can also see, immediately, the problem hiding inside that kindness, because protection you cannot refuse is not quite protection. It's something else. It has another name, and we'll come to it. For now, stay in that parlour with me a little longer. The ink on your new signature is drying. Your name is already becoming, in a legal sense, a kind of ghost. And there's a question sitting in the room with you, one that almost nobody asked out loud. Who decided that a wife should vanish? And how on earth did they convince themselves it was a mercy? Hold that question for a moment, and stay in the scene with me. Because the strangeness of it lives in the small things, not the grand ones. Look down at the table again. Beside the inkwell there's a little wooden box. You'd know it anywhere. It's yours. Inside are a few coins, saved carefully over several years. A small gift of money from your grandmother, pressed into your hand one afternoon with a look that said, "Keep this for yourself." An hour ago that money was yours in the fullest sense the law allowed. You could have spent it, hidden it, given it away, or simply kept it against a rainy day. Now as the ink dries, that little box of coins belongs to your husband, not shared with him, his. You didn't hand it over. Nobody carried it across the room. The ownership simply moved, quietly, through the air, the moment the marriage was sealed. That's the part that unsettles people. There was no transaction you could have refused. It was already done. And it wasn't only the coins. Think of the whole small world of things a young woman gathered around herself. A writing desk, perhaps, with a shallow drawer that locked. A few books with her name inked on the first page. A shawl she was fond of folded in a chest. A ring from her mother. Some of those things the law let her keep the use of. Her clothes, her personal ornaments, the small items a woman was expected to have about her. Lawyers had a word for these too. They called them paraphernalia. Her husband technically owned them, but he generally couldn't sell them out from under her while they both lived. Which sounds almost generous, until you notice the shape of it. Even the shawl around your shoulders was yours only on loan. Yours to wear, not quite yours to own. The distinction seems small on a warm morning. It grows teeth later. Now, I don't want to leave you thinking these women simply stood by, blank and helpless, while their lives were rearranged. That's the easy story, and it's wrong. They noticed. They felt it. And many of them, long before the wedding, had already begun to think their way around it. A clever woman knew exactly what marriage would cost her in law. She'd watched it happen to her mother, her aunts, her married friends. And so, in the weeks before a wedding, there were often quiet conversations, with a father, with a brother, with a family lawyer who chewed his pen and frowned at figures. We'll follow those conversations soon because they're some of the most surprising in this whole story. For now, just hold on to this. The disappearing was real, but so was the pushing back. Let's stay one more moment in that parlour and let the house wake up around you. Somewhere down the passage there's the clatter of a breakfast being laid. The good china, the kind that only appears on days that matter. The smell of warm bread drifting under the door. A wedding is, among many other things, a very large meal. You catch your reflection, faint, in the dark glass of the window. You look exactly as you did yesterday. Same face, same hands, same steady heartbeat. Nothing about you has changed that a portrait painter could capture, and yet everything the law could see about you has changed completely. That's the quiet vertigo at the centre of this whole subject. The gap between the woman in the mirror, entirely herself, and the woman on paper who's just been folded away. Your gown for the day is laid out, or perhaps you're already in it. Let's say it's a soft muslin, the fashion of the moment, pale as cream. Later it will be brushed down, wrapped in linen and put carefully away in a chest. And in a strange way, the dress and the woman share a fate today. Both will be folded, both will be kept. Both, in the eyes of the law, now belong to someone else. I promise the story doesn't stay this melancholy. There's cleverness ahead, and warmth, and more than a little quiet defiance. But we have to feel the weight of the thing first, or none of the escapes from it will mean very much. So breathe and let the scene hold. The ink is dry now. Your name sits on the paper, finished, and the whole invisible machinery of the law has already begun, silently, to close around it. To understand how that machinery worked, we have to meet the man who explained it more clearly than anyone. He never intended to become the voice of a woman's disappearance, but his words shaped how an entire empire understood marriage, ownership, and the strange arithmetic that turned two people into one. Before we meet him, though, think about your own life for a moment. Think about how often, in an ordinary week, you sign your own name. Parcel arrives and you sign for it. You agree to something with the tap of your finger. You put your name to a lease, a form, a card. Each little signature is a quiet statement. It says, "I am a person, and my word counts." Now imagine that gone. Imagine every one of those small signatures needing someone else's permission first. That's closer to the daily texture of a married woman's life than any dramatic scene of oppression. It wasn't loud, it was constant. 1,000 tiny doors, each one requiring a key she did not hold. And the man who described the room those doors led into was a lawyer named William Blackstone. Now, I should be honest about who he was because it matters. Blackstone was not some cruel villain rubbing his hands over the subjection of women. He was a scholar, a rather dry, careful, methodical Englishman who lived in the 1700s and who set himself an enormous task. He wanted to take the tangled, chaotic mess of English law and explain it plainly in a way an educated person could actually follow. He mostly succeeded. His great work was called the Commentaries on the Laws of England, published across the 1760s, and it became something close to a Bible for the legal world. Lawyers read it, judges leaned on it. It crossed oceans and shaped the law in far-off colonies. For generations, if you wanted to know what English law actually was, you reached for Blackstone. Which means that when Blackstone described marriage, he wasn't inventing the rules. He was writing down in clear and quotable prose a system that already existed, but he described it so memorably that his words became the version everyone remembered. And here is what he wrote. He said that by marriage, the very being, the legal existence of the woman, was suspended, as though her legal self were a lamp, and marriage simply reached up and turned the wick down until the flame went out. He put it another way too, in a phrase that has echoed for 2 centuries. Husband and wife, he wrote, are one person in law, one person. And though he didn't say it quite so bluntly, everyone understood which of the two that one person was. Stay with the strangeness of that for a moment. Not 2 people making decisions together. Not a senior partner and a junior partner. One person. The wife's legal identity didn't shrink. It was absorbed, folded inward, tucked entirely beneath her husband's until it could no longer be seen from the outside. Blackstone even had a tidy Latin phrase for the whole doctrine. He called it coverture, from the old idea of covering, of one thing laid over another. The wife was the feme covert, the covered woman, and her condition was called her coverture, a single word to describe the disappearance of a person. What I find genuinely striking is how gentle the language is. Suspended, covered, incorporated. These are soft, almost cozy words. There's nothing violent in them. You could read Blackstone's description and, if you weren't paying attention, mistake it for a description of tenderness. 2 people so close they've become one. Isn't that lovely? Except that in law, closeness had a direction. It all flowed one way. His name, his decisions, his ownership, her presence quietly folded underneath. Now, Blackstone himself seemed to sense that this needed some justifying, and the justification he reached for is the one we brushed against earlier: protection. He argued that the whole arrangement was, and I'm putting this in plainer words than he used, for the woman's own benefit. She was so cared for, so favoured and protected by the law, that she needn't trouble herself with the burdens of legal personhood at all. There's a famous, slightly awkward line where he suggests that the very disabilities a wife lived under were mostly intended for her protection and benefit. And then he adds, almost cheerfully, that this shows what a favourite the female sex is with the laws of England. I'll let that sit for a second. A woman who could not own her wages, could not sign a contract, couldn't keep her own inheritance, was the favourite of the law, according to this reasoning, because look how much it protected her. from, among other things, herself. It's easy to be angry at that. But I think it's more useful to be curious about it, because it reveals how the system stayed standing for so long. The people inside it, many of them decent, genuinely believed the cage was a kind of shelter, and a shelter is a very hard thing to argue your way out of. Who complains about being protected? That's the quiet genius and the quiet cruelty of the whole idea. It dressed a restriction in the clothes of a kindness. It told a woman that the walls around her were there to keep the weather off. Some women believed it. Others saw the walls perfectly clearly and simply learned, as clever people always do, where the gaps were. So let's bring this back to you standing in that parlour. The ink is long dry now. Somewhere a copy of Blackstone sits on a shelf in a lawyer's office. Its pages explain in calm and orderly prose exactly what has just happened to you. You have not been harmed. You have not been robbed, not in any way a court would recognise. You have simply been protected, so thoroughly protected that you can no longer act for yourself at all. And that word protection is about to become very concrete. Because being one person in law wasn't an abstract idea that stayed politely on the page. It reached directly into your pockets, your purse, the coins in that little wooden box. It decided who owned the very clothes on your back. But before we follow the money, let me show you the shape of the thing another way, through the small doors that quietly closed. Because the disappearance wasn't only about property, it was about action, about all the ordinary things a person does in the world, and how many of them a wife suddenly could not do alone. Picture the everyday moments we never think twice about. Signing an agreement, putting your name to a document and having it hold. A single woman did this freely. A wife, in general, could not. Her signature alone on a contract did not bind the way a free person's did. To act in the world of business, she needed him, his name, his authority, his yes. Think of going to law. If someone wronged you, cheated you, owed you money, you might take them to court. A single woman could do this in her own name, stand as herself before the law and demand justice. A married woman in general could not sue on her own. Her husband had to be part of it. Even her grievances, even the wrongs done to her could not fully be hers to pursue. They belonged, like everything else, to the partnership he headed. Or imagine wanting to lend a friend some money, or stand as guarantor for someone in need, or make a gift of something valuable. These small acts of generosity and trust, the ordinary currency of adult life, required a wife to have a husband's backing. She could not freely give what was, in law, not hers to give. Do you feel how it accumulates? Not one great wall, but 1,000 small closed doors. Each one on its own might seem a minor thing. Together they enclosed a life. Everywhere a woman turned to act as a full adult in the world, she found the same gentle resistance. Not now, not alone, not without him. And the strangest part is how invisible it all was from the outside. A married woman walked and talked and shopped and visited exactly like anyone else. Nothing about her looked enclosed. The walls were made of law, not stone, and law casts no shadow you can see. She carried her limits with her quietly. The way you carry a key you've forgotten is in your pocket. Most of the time, life simply flowed around them, and then, at some particular moment, she would reach for a door that wouldn't open, and remember exactly where she stood. So let's follow the money. Let's look, in plain and specific detail, at exactly what became your husband's the moment you became one person. Because the list is longer and stranger than most people ever imagine. Start with the most obvious thing: money. Any cash a woman owned outright at the moment of marriage simply passed to her husband. Not held in trust for her, not shared in some joint account, an idea that barely existed in the modern sense. It became his, to spend or save or lose as he saw fit. Then there were her goods, her movable possessions, what the law lumped together as chattels, furniture, jewels, livestock if she had any, the contents of her purse, the linens in her chest. On marriage, these too became her husband's property. He could sell them. He could give them away. He rarely needed to ask, and her wages. This one lands hardest of all for modern ears. If a married woman worked, and enormous numbers of them did, taking in laundry, keeping a shop, dressmaking, brewing, midwifery, teaching, her earnings were not hers. The money she made with her own hands, her own hours, her own skill, belonged in law to her husband. She could labour from dawn to dark, and the wage was his to claim. Picture that for a moment in the most ordinary terms. A woman stands behind the counter of a little shop from morning till night. She weighs the goods, she counts the change, she balances the takings, she knows every customer by name. It is by any sensible measure her shop, her work, her income. And at the end of the day, the law says the money in the drawer is her husband's. Most of the time, of course, life didn't feel like a courtroom. Couples pooled and shared and got along, and plenty of husbands never dreamed of touching their wives' earnings unfairly. The law was a sleeping thing most days, but it was there, and it woke up at exactly the worst moments. When a marriage soured, when a husband drank or gambled or simply decided he wanted what was, in law, already his. Now, land was a slightly different story, and this is where the machinery gets genuinely intricate. If a woman owned actual land or buildings, what the lawyers called real property, the situation was a little different. Marriage didn't hand that ownership outright to her husband, not in quite the same way as it did her coins, but it did hand him the control. He took the rents, he managed it, he pocketed whatever the land produced. She still owned it, in a distant, technical sense, the way you might own a house you're never allowed to enter. She held the title, he held the keys, the income and the say. And if the couple had a child, his grip tightened further still. There were rules, old and complicated, that could give a husband a life interest in his wife's land once an heir was born. The details would put anyone to sleep, which on this channel is not entirely unwelcome, but the thrust of it is simple. The longer a marriage lasted, and the more children it produced, the more thoroughly a wife's property drifted out of her reach. There's another piece to this that people rarely think about, and it turns the whole picture around in a surprising way. We've been talking about what a woman brought into a marriage, but marriage, in this world, usually ran on money moving in a very particular direction, from her family to his household. It was called her portion, or her dowry, and understanding it changes how you see the whole arrangement. When a woman of property married, her family typically settled a sum of money or property on the union. This was her portion, and here's the part that startles people. In the ordinary run of things, that money passed into her husband's control the moment they wed. Her family handed over a fortune, and the law placed it in his hands, not hers. She was, in a sense, the vessel through which one family's wealth flowed into another's keeping. Turn that over, and you see the strange economics underneath every Regency courtship. A young woman with a large portion was a prize, not because of the money she would enjoy, but because of the money her husband would gain. Her value in the marriage market was coldly the size of the sum that would follow her through the church door and into his accounts. The wealthier the bride, the more eagerly she was pursued, and the less of that wealth she would ever personally command. This is why the marriage settlements we'll come to mattered so enormously. A wise family, handing over a daughter's portion, wanted assurances. If they were giving up a fortune, they wanted at least some of it protected, tied up safely, so that a spendthrift or unlucky husband couldn't simply lose it all. The negotiations before a wealthy wedding were, in truth, negotiations about her money, conducted mostly by men on her behalf, about the wealth that had been hers and was about to become his. And consider what happened if things went wrong. Imagine a husband who gambled or speculated badly, or simply spent without sense. His debts were his own, but the money he spent might well be the fortune his wife had brought. A woman could watch, powerless in law, as her family's fortune was frittered away. Wealth they had spent a generation building gone, to a man she could not stop. She owned none of it. She could reclaim none of it. She could only watch. That helplessness in the face of a husband's ruin was one of the sharpest fears of the age. A woman's whole security and her children's could rest on a man's judgment, and there was little she could legally do if that judgment failed. It puts the desperate care of those marriage negotiations into a very human light. Families were not being cold when they haggled over settlements. They were trying to build a wall between their daughter and disaster. So let's lay it all out plainly, the whole quiet inventory. Her cash, gone to him. Her goods and furniture, his. Her wages, his. Her land, controlled by him, its income flowing into his hands, her very dowry, the fortune her family gave, passing into his keeping. Even her clothes and jewels, that soft category of paraphernalia, owned by him, worn by her only on a kind of permanent loan. What's left, when you tally it up, is almost nothing that the law would call her own. She entered marriage as a woman with possessions. She continued as a woman surrounded by possessions that were, every one of them, someone else's. And yet, here's where the story refuses to stay simple, because the wealthier and cleverer families of the age looked at this whole tidy system of disappearance, and they did something rather remarkable. They found a way to build a hidden room inside it, a space where a married woman's property could survive, protected, untouched by the very law that said it shouldn't exist at all. That hidden room had a name and a set of keys and a court of its own to guard it, and building it was one of the most ingenious things the age ever did on behalf of its daughters. But before we step into that room, let's stay honest about who could reach it. Because this escape hatch was not open to everyone. It took money to build, and lawyers to draw it up, and a family with enough foresight to bother. The laundress and the shopkeeper's wife rarely had any of those things. The escape we're about to explore belonged, for the most part, to daughters of the comfortable and the rich. That's worth holding on to as we go. The law of disappearance fell on every married woman alike. The tools to soften it did not. And so the story from here forward is partly a story about class and about who gets to keep a little piece of themselves. Come with me, then, into that hidden room. The room, of course, wasn't a real place. It was built out of paper and cleverness, and a second, stranger system of law that ran quietly alongside the first. To understand it, you have to know something that surprises almost everyone. In this period, England didn't have one law. It had two, side by side, sometimes disagreeing with each other in the same breath. The first was the common law. That's the harsh, tidy system we've been living inside so far. The one that said a wife was covered, absorbed, one person with her husband. The common law was old, rigid, and famously unbothered by whether its results seemed fair. But over the centuries, a second system had grown up beside it, precisely because the first could be so unforgiving. It was called equity, and equity was, at its heart, an attempt to soften the hard edges of the law with something closer to conscience. Here's the part that matters for our story. Equity was willing to see a married woman as a separate person in ways the common law flatly refused to. Where the common law saw one person, equity was prepared, under the right conditions, to see two. And in that small gap between the two systems, wealthy families built their hidden room. The tool they used was called a marriage settlement. And if you take only one new idea from tonight, let it be this one, because it quietly rewrites the whole picture. A marriage settlement was a legal arrangement, drawn up before the wedding. It set aside part of a woman's property and protected it from her husband's control. Think about the timing of that. Before the wedding, while she was still a feme soul, still a full legal person with the power to bargain. That was the window. In the weeks and months before a marriage, when she still had legal hands to act with, arrangements could be made that would outlive her disappearance. Picture the scene, because it's a very human one. A father who loves his daughter and who is not naive about the man she's marrying. A lawyer at the table, spectacles low on his nose. Documents, drafts, quiet negotiation. They are in effect building a wall around a portion of her future, brick by legal brick, before the law can wash it away. What they created was often called her separate estate, money or property that would be hers alone, inside the marriage, held apart from her husband's reach. It might be managed by trustees, people appointed to hold it on her behalf. That way, legally, it never sat in a place where her husband could seize it, and the effect could be genuinely startling. A married woman with a well-drawn separate estate could have her own income. She could receive rents. She could, in the eyes of equity, direct her own money, even while the common law insisted she was no one at all. Inside the same marriage, she was two women at once, invisible in one court and quietly powerful in another. Let that contradiction hang in the air for a moment, because it's the beating heart of the whole subject. Everything you've heard about the powerlessness of these women is true, and at the very same time, some of them were managing separate fortunes through trustees, protected by one of the highest courts in the land. Both things in the same person, on the same day. There was another piece to this, and it has a lovely, slightly comic name: pin money. You've probably heard the phrase used lightly to mean pocket change, a trivial little sum. Its origins are anything but trivial. Pin money was an allowance written into the marriage settlement that a husband was obliged to pay his wife for her own personal use. The name comes from an older world, when pins and small personal necessities were a genuine expense a woman had to cover. But by the Regency, pin money could be a serious figure, negotiated hard by careful families. It was, in effect, a wife's private income, hers to spend on clothes, on charity, on small freedoms, without asking permission for every shilling. And here's the surprising sting in it. Because pin money was part of a formal settlement, it could, in principle, be enforced. A wife whose husband failed to pay could, through the machinery of equity, have a claim to it. Imagine the strangeness of that. A woman who could not own the coins in her own purse could, through this one clever door, take steps against him, steps to make her husband pay the income he owed. I don't want to oversell it. These were not easy fights, and a woman rarely dragged her own husband through a court over an allowance. The social cost alone was enormous. But the principle existed. The door was there, even if few chose to walk through it. And the very existence of that door tells you something important. These women and the families around them were not passive. They were strategists working the seams of the system with real skill. Now, all of this cleverness needed somewhere to live, a court willing to enforce these arrangements, to hold trustees to their word, to take a married woman's separate property seriously. And that court had a name that still carries a certain weight and a certain dread: the Court of Chancery. Chancery was the home of equity. It was where these settlements and trusts and separate estates were protected and fought over. If the common law was the blunt instrument, Chancery was the delicate one, the court of conscience, the place where fairness was supposed to temper the rules. I say supposed to, and I say it with a small dry smile, because Chancery had a reputation. Two reputations, really. One was for genuine fairness and subtlety. The other was for being unbelievably, catastrophically slow. A case in Chancery could crawl on for years, sometimes for decades. Sometimes a case outlived the very people who had started it. You've perhaps heard echoes of this. Later in the century, a great novelist would build an entire story around a Chancery case, one so endless that it devoured the very fortune it was meant to divide. That was fiction, but only barely. The slowness was real, and it was legendary even at the time. Which brings us gently to the man who sat at the very top of that court for much of this period. Before I name him, think about what kind of person ends up as the guardian of a nation's conscience court. Someone careful, someone cautious, someone who would rather turn a problem over 100 times than decide it too quickly. That describes the man almost perfectly. His name was John Scott, and he's better known by his title, Lord Eldon. For a great stretch of the early 1800s, he served as Lord Chancellor, the highest judge in the land, presiding over Chancery and its slow, careful business. Now I have to pause and be precise here, because names are where these stories go wrong. John Scott, Lord Eldon, had a brother, also a famous judge, called William Scott, who became Lord Stowell. Two brothers, two titles, two courts. Eldon in Chancery, Stowell in the world of Church and Admiralty courts. They're easy to confuse, and I don't intend to. When I say Lord Eldon, I mean John Scott, the Lord Chancellor, the guardian of equity. Eldon was famous and often mocked for his caution. He agonized over decisions. He delayed and weighed and delayed again. To his critics, he was the very engine of Chancery's slowness, a man who could keep a case suspended for years while he made up his mind. To his defenders, that same caution was conscience itself, a refusal to do quick injustice. And here's why he matters to a woman's separate estate. It was courts like his, working through the principles of equity, that made these protections real. A settlement is only worth the paper it's drawn on if some court will enforce it. Chancery, for all its maddening slowness, was that court. The very institution that could ruin you with delay was also the one keeping your separate fortunes safe from a grasping husband. So bring it back to yourself standing in that world. If your father was wealthy and wise, if the lawyers did their work, then somewhere in a strong box there's document, one that keeps a piece of you alive, an income the common law says you cannot have, a fortune held by trustees, a private allowance your husband is bound to pay. You are on paper no one, and also through this hidden room quietly someone. It's a strange kind of freedom, Partial, expensive, available mostly to the fortunate few, but it's real, and it's clever, and it deserves to be remembered alongside all the disappearing. Because the women of this age were not simply erased. Many of them, and the families who loved them, spent enormous effort learning exactly how to write themselves, faintly but permanently, back onto the page. There was, however, one moment when even the cleverest settlement met its limit. One act so final that the law guarded it with particular care, and where a wife's silence could be most complete. The making of a will. The quiet, enormous question of who receives what you leave behind. Think about what a will really is underneath the legal language. It's a voice that speaks after you're gone. It's the last time your wishes get to move things in the world. You decide who gets the house, the ring, the small treasured thing that meant everything to you. It is, in a sense, the final act of being a person, your say, extended one step beyond your own life. And for a married woman, that final voice was, in most ordinary circumstances, taken away. Here is the shape of it. Because a wife owned so little in her own legal right, she had for the most part little she could freely give away by will, and beyond that the general rule of the common law was this: a married woman could not make a valid will disposing of property without her husband's consent. Notice the coldness of that arrangement for a moment. Not only did she own almost nothing while she lived, she could not freely decide the fate of even that little once she died. The last voice, the after-death voice, needed his permission to speak at all, and the cruelest edge of it was this: that consent could be withdrawn. A husband might agree, kindly, that his wife could leave a small legacy to a sister, a servant, a beloved godchild. And then, even at the very end, even at the bedside, he could change his mind and revoke it. The permission was never truly hers. It was a loan, and it could be called back at the worst imaginable moment. Picture that scene, though gently, because we are drifting toward the quieter part of our night. A woman near the end of a long life. She has a few things she has kept close. A locket, a little money she thinks of as her own, a wish, clear and simple, about where it should go, and whether that wish holds depends not on her, but on the man beside the bed, on whether he chooses, in that final hour, to let her have her way. Most husbands, I want to believe, did let her have it. History is not only a record of its harshest rules. Countless quiet kindnesses passed between real married people that no law ever recorded. But the rule stood behind all of it, like a cold draught under a warm door. Her last wishes were his to grant or deny. And yet remember that hidden room we built together, back in the quieter light of the settlement. It reached even here, even into the making of a will, because a woman with a separate estate, held for her in equity, could often be given the power to leave that property as she chose. The settlement could say so, in plain words drawn up years before. So the same cleverness that protected her money while she lived could also hand her back her voice, if the lawyers were careful, even at the very end, not the common law's gift, equities. A last word, purchased in advance, tucked into a document and kept safe against the day she would need it. There's a strange tenderness in that when you think about what it really was. A father drawing up a settlement for a daughter not yet married, quietly making sure of something, that one day, decades away, she would be allowed to say where her locket should go. He was arranging her freedom to speak from beyond a moment he would never see. That's a peculiar kind of love, the kind that plans for a grief far off and softens it in advance, Now let's widen the view for a moment and be fair to the whole picture. A married woman was not always a silent figure in the world of wills and property. She might serve as the executor of someone else's will, carrying out a dead friend's wishes. She might be a beloved beneficiary, remembered generously by others. The law that muffled her own voice did not stop other voices from naming her, choosing her, trusting her. And a widow, as we'll see before the night is done, stepped fully back into all these powers at once. The muffling was a condition of marriage, not of womanhood. Take away the husband, and the voice returned, whole and clear, as though it had only been holding its breath. But we're not at the widow yet. There's a harder thing to speak about first. Because so far everything the law took from a married woman was in the end a thing. Coins, land, furniture, a locket. Objects however precious, and objects however painful to lose, are still only objects. There was one thing the law placed under a husband's control that's not a thing at all. It breathed, it grew, it called her mother. We have to talk gently and carefully about the children. Let me start where it hurts least, with the simple legal shape of it, before we come anywhere near the feeling. In this world, the father was regarded as the natural guardian of his legitimate children, not the mother, the father. His authority over them was, in law, close to absolute. What that meant in practice is hard for a modern heart to take in. A married mother had almost no independent legal right to her own children. She carried them, bore them, fed them, raised them, sat up through their fevers in the dark. And in the eyes of the common law, they were not, in the deepest legal sense, hers to keep. The orienting fact is stark enough. The specific detail is what makes it land. If a marriage broke down and the couple separated, the father had the legal power to keep the children entirely. He could decide where they lived. He could decide whether their mother was allowed to see them at all. And if he chose to shut that door, the law would, for the most part, stand behind him and hold it shut. Let me put that in the plainest human terms I can. A woman could lose her husband's affection, her home, her income, and her children in a single stroke. And of all those losses, the children were the one the law was least willing to give back. She might be permitted to see them. She might not. That choice, staggeringly, was largely his. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to paint every father as a tyrant, and that's neither true nor kind. Most fathers loved their children, and had no wish to tear them from their mother. Families muddled through, together, with all the ordinary warmth you'd expect. The law describing a power is not the same as the power always being used, but the power was real, and its mere existence changed everything, even in happy homes, because a wife knew, somewhere underneath the daily tenderness, what a true rupture would cost her, not just the marriage, her sons and daughters too. That knowledge shaped 1,000 quiet decisions. It taught women to endure, to smooth things over, to stay. When leaving might mean losing your children, leaving stops being a real choice at all. That's the cruelest math in this whole story, I think. Not any single rule, but the way the rules stack together into a kind of gentle cage. No money of her own, so she could not easily support herself if she left. No claim to her children, so leaving might cost her them. Each bar of the cage on its own might be borne. Together they held a woman in place more firmly than any lock. You feel the weight of it, I think, even at this distance. Anyone who has loved a child feels it. The idea that the loving, the daily fierce work of raising them, could count for so little against a single line of law. And here is the small, late light in it, the thing worth holding as we soften towards sleep. This did not last. People saw the cruelty of it, and slowly began to push back. About 2 decades after our Regency evening, the law took its first real step. A change was made that allowed some mothers, for the first time, to petition to keep their youngest children with them. It was narrow, it was late, it helped only a few, but it was a beginning, and it came because people refused to accept that a mother was a stranger to her own child. We'll return to that flicker of change a little later, and to the woman whose own heartbreak helped light it. For now, let it be enough to know that the door, so firmly shut in our Regency parlour, did not stay shut forever. Hands were already reaching in the years ahead to ease it open, so let's step back from the hardest ground and breathe again. We've walked through the taking of her money, her goods, her wages, her last wishes, and her children. It's a heavy inventory. But this story has another side, and it's a genuinely surprising one, because the same law that erased a married woman could also, now and then, protect her in ways she never asked for. Sometimes the disappearing became a strange kind of shield. Here's the logic, and it follows perfectly from everything we've learned. A husband and wife were one person in law. The husband was the head of that person. So who was truly responsible for what the wife did? The answer, sometimes, was him. Take debt, that most ordinary of troubles. A wife could rarely be sued for debts in her own name, because in law she had no separate purse to pay from, so her creditors turned to her husband instead. He had swallowed her legal self, and with it, he had swallowed her bills. The man who owned everything she brought also owed for much of what she spent. Ownership and liability arrived, fittingly, in the same package. And here's a contradiction that shows just how tangled the whole thing was. A married woman could not fully manage her own affairs, yet the law was often perfectly willing to let her manage other people's. She might be named the executor of a friend's or relative's will, trusted to gather up a dead person's estate, pay their debts, carry out their final wishes. She might act as a trustee, holding property carefully for someone else's benefit. She might even be a guardian. Entrusted was a child's welfare and fortune. Notice the oddness of that arrangement for a moment. In one breath, the law declared a wife too legally insubstantial to own her own wages. In the next, it handed her the solemn duty of administering an entire estate that wasn't hers, trusting her judgment, her honesty, her competence completely. She was capable enough to be trusted with the stranger's fortune, and not capable enough to be trusted with her own. Both things were true at once. The law rarely paused to notice the contradiction. What it reveals, I think, is that nobody actually believed married women were incapable. That was never really the point, whatever the soft language of protection suggested. Everyone knew women were shrewd, capable, and entirely able to manage money and people. They managed households, estates, and other people's legacies all the time. The rules of coverture were not a genuine judgment about ability. They were about control and property and the orderly passing of wealth from one man to another. The talk of protection was the wrapping. The keeping of control was the gift inside. There was a stranger version of this too, reaching all the way into the criminal courts. The law developed an idea we might call marital coercion. In certain cases, if a wife committed an offence in her husband's presence, the courts could presume she had acted under his command, not of her own free will, but bent to his, and on that presumption she might escape punishment altogether. Think about the reasoning underneath that. It assumes a wife has so little separate will, is so thoroughly folded into her husband, that she can barely be blamed for her own actions. It is, when you turn it over, one of the most insulting ideas imaginable. and it could also, on the right day, keep a woman out of prison. Insult and rescue stitched into a single doctrine. Now this shelter had firm limits, and I don't want to overstate it. It never covered the gravest crimes. For something like treason or murder, no such excuse applied. A woman was fully answerable for the worst deeds, whatever her husband's role. The law's tenderness, such as it was, extended only to the smaller offences. It would excuse her a little, but never for the things that mattered most. Still, notice the shape of the whole arrangement, because it's genuinely strange. The very idea that erased her, the notion that she had no independent legal self, was the same idea that occasionally protected her. Being no one, it turned out, had its rare uses. You could not easily be blamed for what, in the eyes of the law, you'd never quite done as yourself. There's a dry joke buried in that, and I'll let it stay dry. The law spent enormous effort insisting a married woman had no separate existence. And then, when a debt came due or a small charge was laid, it discovered the same convenient nothing and handed the trouble to her husband. A person too insignificant to own her wages was, at just the right moment, too insignificant to blame. Consistency was never the point. Convenience usually was. But I don't want you to hear this as the law being secretly kind. It wasn't. These protections were accidents, side effects of a system built for other reasons entirely. A woman did not choose them. She could not rely on them. They fell where they fell, like sunlight through a shutter, warming a patch of floor no one had aimed it at. And through all of this, the disappearing and the sheltering, the settlements and the silences, ordinary life simply went on. Weddings were celebrated, households were run, children were loved and raised. Most people never read a word of Blackstone and never set foot in Chancery. They lived inside these rules the way we all live inside laws we've never studied, half aware, mostly getting on with things, which raises a lovely question, and it carries us gently onward. If most people barely noticed the machinery, how do we know so much about how it truly felt? Who was paying close enough attention to capture it? Not as dry law, but as the texture of real lives? As it happens, someone was. Someone sat in exactly this world, watched it with an unusually clear and quietly amused eye, and wrote it all down. Not as legal history, as stories. And in doing so, she preserved the feeling of coverture more faithfully than any law book ever could. Her name was Jane Austen. You know the name, almost certainly. And that's exactly why I want to slow down here. Because familiarity can hide a person from us. We think of her as a maker of romances, a writer of witty courtships that end in weddings and good fortune. That's there, of course. But underneath the wit, Austen was doing something quietly radical. She was writing with unblinking clarity about money, about property, about what marriage did to a woman's security, and what it cost her if she chose wrong, or was simply unlucky. Let me place her precisely in our story first. Jane Austen lived from the 1770s into the early 1800s, and she died young, in 1817, right in the heart of the Regency. She wrote from inside the very world we've been describing. These were not historical curiosities to her. They were the rules of her own life, and the lives of every woman she knew. And here's a detail that I find quietly telling. Austen herself never married. She remained, in the language we've learned tonight, a feme soul to the end of her life. She kept her own legal personhood, such as it was for a woman of modest means. She once accepted a proposal of marriage, and then, overnight, changed her mind and refused it the next morning. Whatever her reasons, the woman who understood the marriage bargain better than almost anyone chose, in the end, not to make it. Now, watch what she does in her novels, because it's masterful. She almost never lectures you about the law, she simply lets you feel its gravity, pulling at every decision her characters make. Marriage in Austen is never only about love, it's about survival. Who will be provided for? Who will be left exposed? Whose future rests on securing the right husband, because there is no other route to security at all? Consider the engine that drives one of her most beloved novels. A family of daughters, a comfortable home, and a single cruel legal fact hanging over all of them. The family estate is entailed. That's a legal arrangement, and it's worth understanding because it shadows the whole story. An entail dictated that certain property must pass down a fixed line of heirs, and in this case it could only pass to a male relative. Follow what that means for the daughters. Their father is not poor. There is a house, an income, a whole settled life, and none of it can come to them. On their father's death, the entire estate is destined to pass to a distant male cousin, a man they barely know. The daughters will keep almost nothing. The roof over their heads is, in the most literal sense, promised to someone else. That single legal fact is the quiet terror humming beneath all the balls and banter. It's why marriage matters so desperately in that world. It isn't vanity or romance driving the urgency. It's arithmetic. A woman who cannot inherit, who cannot easily earn, who will lose her home when her father dies, finds that marriage is not a happy ending. It is a life raft. And Austen sees all of this with a gaze that is warm and merciless at once. She lets us laugh at the absurd suitors and the scheming mothers, and underneath the laughter, she never once lets us forget the stakes. A woman who marries badly in Austen is not merely unhappy. She is trapped, legally and financially for good. There is no easy door out. We've spent tonight learning why. There's a line of thinking she returns to again and again without ever spelling it out. A woman's whole future could turn on a single choice made in her early 20s, often on incomplete information, under enormous family pressure. Choose well, and you are secure for life. Choose badly, and the law would hold you to that choice with all its quiet iron. No wonder her heroines agonize. The decision really was that final. So when we read Austen now, we're not just enjoying a love story. We're reading the most vivid surviving record of how coverture felt from the inside. The anxiety of the unmarried daughter, the relief of the well-settled bride, the barely spoken fear of the woman with no fortune and no prospects. She turned the dry machinery of the law into something you could feel in your chest. That was her genius, and it's why she has never left us. Let me bring this back to you, wherever you're resting tonight. The next time a version of one of her stories drifts across your screen, all bonnets and candlelight and longing glances, pause. Remember what's actually turning underneath it. Not just who loves whom, but who will be safe and who will not, in a world where a woman's security ran entirely through a wedding ring. Austen knew. She wrote it all down, smiling, so that we would know too. And she raises, without ever asking it directly, the question that sits at the very centre of tonight. If marriage could trap a woman so completely, was there ever a way out? If you chose wrong, or if the man you married turned cruel, could you simply leave? The honest answer is hard and it's important, so let's walk through it slowly. For the vast majority of people, the answer was no. There was no easy leaving. There was certainly no simple divorce as we understand the word today. The marriage you made in your 20s was, in almost every case, the marriage you would have until one of you died. But almost every case is not quite every case. There were doors. They were narrow and heavy and fearfully expensive to open. Still, they existed, and they're worth knowing about. They show just how far a person had to go to undo what a single signature had done. The first door was separation, rather than true divorce. A couple could in effect live apart. Sometimes this was arranged privately, through a formal deed drawn up between them, often involving those same trustees and settlements we met earlier. The marriage still existed in law. Neither could remarry. But they could agree to live separate lives and to divide carefully the money between them. For a woman, such an arrangement was a fragile thing, but it could be a lifeline. A well-drawn separation could secure her an income to live on, apart from a husband she could no longer bear to live beside. It didn't restore her legal personhood. It didn't give her back her children as a right. But it could buy her peace, and a roof, and a measure of quiet. In a world with so few exits, even a partial one mattered enormously. The second door was the true one. Full divorce with the right to remarry. And this is where the sheer difficulty becomes almost hard to believe. For most of this period, there was really only one way to obtain a complete divorce in England. You had to get an Act of Parliament, a private law passed by the lawmakers of the entire nation, dissolving one single marriage. Take that in for a moment. To end your marriage, the same body that declared wars and raised taxes and governed an empire had to stop. It had to consider your particular household and pass a law about it by name. It was slow, it was public, it was humiliating, and it was so ruinously expensive that it lay far beyond the reach of nearly everyone alive. The numbers tell the story better than any description could. Across this whole era, full parliamentary divorces were vanishingly rare. We're not talking about thousands or even hundreds a year. We're talking about a mere handful of cases in an average year, in a country of many millions. Divorce was, in practice, a privilege of the very rich, and even for them, a scandal to be avoided if at all possible. And here is the part that should make you sit up, even as you're drifting down towards sleep. Those rare divorces were almost entirely obtained by men. A husband could bring a case against a wife far more easily than the other way around. For a wife to divorce her husband, it was not enough to prove he had been unfaithful. She generally had to prove something more, some additional grievous wrong on top of the betrayal. The bar was set higher for her deliberately, and it stayed there for decades. So the exits, such as they were, tell you everything about the world we've been walking through. The door of separation, narrow and fragile. The door of divorce, so heavy that almost no one could push it open, and heavier still for a woman than for a man. For the ordinary wife in the ordinary marriage there was no door at all. There was only the life she'd chosen, or the life that had been chosen for her, stretching ahead to the end. Now, you might imagine that wealth and rank could lift a woman above all this, that a lady of fortune, a titled woman, even a princess, would somehow float free of rules made for ordinary lives. And here the age offers up a story so dramatic that it played out on the largest stage the country had. Because even at the summit of society, even in a marriage watched by the whole nation, a woman could find herself caught in these same currents, the very same ones. Let me introduce her carefully, because her name is a trap, and I promised you I would never walk us into one. The woman I mean is Caroline of Brunswick. She became the wife of the man who ruled as Prince Regent, and who later became king. She was, in the most literal sense, as high-born and as grand as a woman could be. Keep her separate, please, from another famous Caroline, a Caroline Norton, who came a little later and whose own story we'll touch before the night is out. Two different women, two different heartbreaks. Tonight, on this grand stage, I mean Caroline of Brunswick, the queen who was very nearly not allowed to be one. Her marriage was a disaster almost from the start, and it was no secret. She and her royal husband were mismatched, unhappy, and quickly living largely apart. In an ordinary couple, this would have been a private sorrow. But she was married to the heir to the throne, and later to the king himself, and so her marriage became a public affair in the fullest sense. The nation watched, the newspapers roared, her private misery became a matter of state. When her husband finally became king, the crisis broke open completely. He wanted to be rid of her. He did not simply want a quiet separation. He wanted her stripped of her title, denied her crown, cast out as his wife in the eyes of the law and the whole country. And to do it, the machinery of the entire state was turned against one woman. What followed was extraordinary. Rather than an ordinary divorce, the matter was pursued through Parliament itself, in a proceeding that put the Queen's own private life on trial before the lords of the land. Her conduct, her friendships, her movements over the years were examined in public, in punishing detail. It was, in effect, an attempt to end a marriage and unmake a queen by act of the legislature, the grandest possible version of that heavy parliamentary door we just described. And here's the twist that makes her story more than just a royal scandal. The public did not side with the king. They sided with her. Crowds filled the streets in her support. Ordinary people, who would never own a fraction of her wealth, saw in her treatment something they recognized. A wife discarded by a powerful husband. A woman judged by rules that seemed to bend cruelly against her. They cheered her carriage. They jeered his ministers. For a strange electric season, a mismatched, imperfect princess became a symbol of every wife who had ever been treated as an inconvenience to be removed. I find the whole episode genuinely remarkable because of what it revealed. Here was proof, on the largest scale imaginable, that these were not merely the troubles of the poor or the powerless. The same essential logic that governed the shopkeeper's wife reached all the way up to the crown. A husband's will, backed by the law, bearing down on a wife who had few good ways to resist. Rank changed the scenery. It did not change the shape of the story. Her tale did not end happily, and I'll not dwell on the sorrow of it here so late in our evening, but hold on to the image of those crowds, because it tells us something hopeful, something that points toward the changes still to come. People were watching. People were beginning to feel that something was wrong. The sympathy in those streets was a small, early sign, a conscience stirring, the same conscience that would, in the years ahead, slowly begin to dismantle the whole quiet machinery of a woman's disappearance. But that dismantling was still, in our Regency evening, far off in the future. For the woman falling asleep in her own bed in 1815, the law was what it was, and there remained one last transformation she might undergo, one final turn of the wheel that could hand her back everything the wedding had taken. It required a loss to set it in motion, but when it came, it was total. The transformation was widowhood. There's something almost startling in it, once you understand the mechanics. The moment a husband died, his widow was no longer a feme covert. She was once again a feme soul, a woman alone in law, and therefore a whole person once more. Everything the marriage had folded away, it now unfolded all at once in a single stroke. Consider the sheer speed of that change. The day before her husband died, she could not sign a binding contract in her own name. The day after, she could. The day before, she could make no will without his leave. The day after, she could leave her property to whomever she pleased. Nothing about her had changed. She was the same woman, with the same mind, the same competence she'd always had. Only the law's eyes had opened. It is one of the strangest features of the whole system when you hold it up to the light. A woman's legal personhood was not tied to her age, her wisdom, her ability, or her character. It was tied entirely to her marital state. Single, she was whole. Married, she vanished. Widowed, she returned. Her legal self blinked in and out of existence, according to the presence or absence of a husband, like a candle carried in and out of a room. And a widow, newly returned to herself, could do a great deal. She could own property outright and manage it herself. She could enter contracts, sue and be sued in her own name, and run a business as its true legal head. Widows across the country did exactly that. They took over their late husbands' shops and trades and farms, and ran them, often for decades, with skill and authority. Many a thriving business was, quietly, a widow's business. Now the law did not simply set her adrift with her restored freedom. It also, in principle, tried to provide for her. And here we meet two more of those careful arrangements the age loved so well. The first was called dower. In its traditional form, dower was a widow's right to a portion of her late husband's lands, a share set aside for her support after his death. The idea was old and deeply rooted. A wife had, in a sense, helped sustain the household, and the law recognized she should not be cast out penniless when her husband died. The second arrangement was jointure, and it often worked hand in hand with those marriage settlements we explored earlier. Jointure was an income or estate settled on a wife specifically to support her in widowhood, arranged in advance. Frequently it formed part of the very same negotiations that had set up her separate estate. A careful family, drawing up the marriage settlement, would look decades ahead. They would see the possibility of her husband's death and make provision for the woman she would become. Think about the tenderness folded into that, and the strategy too. On the eve of a wedding, amid all the hope and celebration, sober people sat down and planned for the groom's death. Not morbidly, practically. They were making sure that if the worst came, the bride would not be left destitute and dependent on the goodwill of heirs. Her widowhood was being cushioned before her marriage had even begun. And a widow's rights could carry real weight against the living too. Dower, in its older form, gave a widow a claim on a share of the lands her husband had held during the marriage. That claim could reach even land the husband had sold. A buyer purchasing an estate had to think about whether some widow somewhere might one day step forward with a dower right attached to it. Her claim could shadow a property for years, quietly, waiting. That gave a woman a kind of ghostly power she may never have recognized in herself. The mere existence of her future dower right shaped how her husband's land could be sold, and to whom, and on what terms. Lawyers had to account for her. Buyers had to be protected against her. The invisible wife, the one the law could barely see, cast a long and stubborn shadow over the very property she supposedly had no part in. Over time, the law found ways to simplify and sometimes to bar dower, especially where a jointure had been provided instead. The two arrangements were often set against each other, a woman taking the settled jointure in place of her older dower claim. But the principle underneath endured. A wife, however covered in life, had a stake in what came after. Death, which took her husband, gave her back a voice. For a woman of property, then, widowhood could be the freest chapter of her adult life. Sit with the quiet irony of that. She had spent her married years legally invisible, her fortune managed by another, her voice muffled. And now, in mourning, in black, in loss, she found herself more fully a legal person than she had been since the day she wed. Grief and liberty arrived in the same envelope. I want to be careful and honest here because it would be easy to romanticize this. Widowhood was not a prize. It came through bereavement, often after nursing a dying husband, sometimes leaving a woman with young children and real fear about the future. For a poor widow, freedom in law meant little when there was no money to go with it. The right to sign a contract does not feed anyone. Let's not pretend the black dress was a gift, but for those with means, the change in status was real and remarkable. And it explains something you can see all through the period, if you know to look for it. The formidable widow, running her household and her money with complete authority. The dowager, presiding over the family with a power no married woman could hold. These were not just strong personalities. They were women whom the law had finally allowed to be whole again. There's a particular kind of woman this produced, and you'd have known her at once, certain of herself, used to being obeyed, managing tenants and accounts and the marriages of the next generation with a firm hand. In the novels of the age, she's sometimes the grand, interfering aunt, or the imposing lady of the great house. We're invited to find her slightly comic, but underneath the comedy is a simple truth. She was, quite often, the only sort of woman the law let stand fully on her own 2 feet. No wonder she stood so firmly, and a widow faced a choice that carried its own quiet weight. She could remarry. Many did, for love, for security, for companionship. But to remarry was to step back into coverture, to vanish, legally, all over again. A widow with her own money and her own authority had to weigh something a young bride never could. What a second marriage would truly cost her. She had tasted legal personhood. Choosing to give it up again, knowingly, was a very different thing from surrendering it the first time. Back then she may hardly have understood what she was losing. Some widows, understanding exactly what marriage would take, chose to keep their freedom instead. They stayed single, ran their affairs, and answered to no husband. It was, for a woman of means, one of the few genuinely free positions the whole system allowed. Widowed, wealthy, and disinclined to marry again. In law, that was very nearly the strongest a woman could be. So the wheel came full circle. She began as a feme soul, whole and legally alive. Marriage covered her, and she vanished. Widowhood uncovered her, and she returned. It was a strange journey to make while sitting still, this appearing and disappearing, all of it decided by the presence of a man beside her. But it shows, more clearly than anything, that her disappearance was never about her. It was about her marriage. Remove the marriage, and the whole person came flooding back. Which leaves us with one last question, and it's the gentlest and most hopeful of the night. If the system was this settled, this old, this deeply woven into everything, how did it ever change? Because it did change. The world you and I live in is not this world. Somewhere between that Regency parlour and tonight, the whole machinery of a woman's disappearance was quietly taken apart. The change did not come all at once, and it did not come easily. It came the way most real change comes. Slowly, unevenly, pushed forward by particular people who had suffered under the old rules and refused to stay silent about it. And one of those people has a name we brushed against earlier, and now, gently, we can meet her properly. Her name was Caroline Norton. And I want to be clear again, because we've been careful about this all night. This is not the Queen we spoke of before, not Caroline of Brunswick. This is a different woman entirely, born later, in the early 1800s, into the years just after our Regency evening. A writer, clever and spirited, who made a disastrous marriage, and then discovered, the hard way, exactly what the law would and would not let her do about it. Her marriage was unhappy and, by many accounts, cruel. When it collapsed, she found herself standing precisely where so many women had stood before her, but with one crucial difference. She had a gift for words and a place in society, and a refusal to accept that her suffering was simply the way of things. Everything we've described tonight, she lived. Her husband controlled the money. Her earnings from her own writing were, in law, potentially his, and her children, the deepest wound of all, were kept from her. That last cruelty was the one that broke something open. Separated from her young sons, with little legal power to reach them, she did something remarkable. She turned her private grief into a public argument. She wrote, she campaigned, she pressed her case in pamphlets and letters and the ears of powerful men, insisting that a mother was not a stranger to her own children, whatever the common law pretended. And slowly, it worked. Her efforts helped bring about that first crack in the wall we mentioned earlier, a change in the law. A couple of decades after our Regency night, some mothers, for the first time, could petition to keep their young children. It was narrow, it was limited, it did not undo coverture. But it was the first time the law admitted, in writing, that a mother had any independent claim to her children at all. One woman's heartbreak had moved the great, slow machinery, just a little. That was only the beginning. Over the decades that followed, piece by piece, the whole edifice was dismantled. Laws were passed years and years after our sleeping woman's time that finally let married women own their own property. That let them keep their own earnings. That recognized at last what now seems so obvious it hardly needs saying, that a wife was a person, a separate, whole, legal person, who did not dissolve into her husband the moment she said her vows. It took most of a century. It took the patient, stubborn work of countless women and no small number of men who came to see the old system for what it was. But the disappearance we've spent tonight exploring did, in the end, come to an end. The feme covert, the covered woman, was slowly, finally, uncovered. And here's the quiet thread that connects her to you, wherever you're lying right now in the dark. Every time you sign your own name and it simply counts, you're standing on the far side of that long change. No husband's permission required, just you. The independence you may never think about was won, slowly, out of exactly the world we've been walking through. Someone had to imagine it before anyone could have it. Women like the one we've been following, and the ones who came after her, did that imagining for you. So let's turn back to her now, our Regency woman, as our evening softens toward its close. Because for all the law took from her, we've seen tonight that she was never as powerless as the rules alone would suggest. Picture her on an ordinary morning, well after the wedding, settled into the long middle of a marriage. She isn't signing settlements or standing before a court. She's moving through a house, and that house is, in every way that matters day to day, hers to run. There's a set of keys at her waist, and those keys tell you more about her real power than any law book ever could. The keys open the stores, the linen press, the tea caddy, the cabinet where the sugar and spices were kept under lock because they were precious enough to guard. A well-run household was a small economy, and she was its manager. She decided what was cooked, what was bought, what was mended, what was saved. She directed the servants. She kept the accounts. She held the whole intricate machine of daily life together with her own 2 hands. None of that was written into the common law as a right, and yet all of it was real. This is the gap I keep wanting you to see. The law described a woman with almost no power at all. Daily life handed a competent wife an enormous amount of it. The 2 pictures sat side by side, contradicting each other every single day in every household in the land. And here's where it gets genuinely surprising, because the law itself had to bend to that reality. It could pretend a wife owned nothing. It could not pretend she never went to the shops. Households had to be fed and clothed, and it was the wife who did the buying. So the law developed a doctrine to account for it, and it's one of the most useful things you'll learn tonight. A married woman was presumed to have her husband's authority to buy necessaries on his credit: food, clothing, the ordinary goods a household needed to run. When she ordered from the butcher or the draper, she was treated as acting for her husband. It was her husband who was bound to pay. The bill was his. The choice of what to buy and where and how much was very often entirely hers. Follow what that actually meant in practice, because it's remarkable. A woman who, in law, could not own a shilling could nonetheless walk into shop after shop. She could commit her husband's money to whatever the household needed. Tradesmen extended credit to her all day long, knowing the law would let them collect from him. She spent his money as a matter of routine. The purse was legally his. The hand reaching into it most of the time was hers. There were limits, of course. The goods had to be genuine necessaries, suited to the couple's rank and style of living. A husband could, in some cases, warn tradesmen not to give his wife credit and protect himself that way. It was not a blank check. But in the ordinary run of a marriage, a wife's power to bind her husband to the household's expenses was a real and daily authority. She was in effect his purchasing agent, whether he thought of it that way or not. I want you to hold those 2 truths together, because their contradiction is the truest thing in this whole story. On paper, she was no one. In the marketplace, she was the household's decision-maker, trusted on sight, her judgment backed by her husband's purse. The disappearance was legal. The presence was constant. She was everywhere in the running of real life, and nowhere in the law that described it. Now there was one corner of the world where the law went further still. It actually let some married women step out of coverture for the purpose of doing business. It happened in certain towns, and most famously in the city of London, under old local custom. A married woman who carried on a trade of her own, separately from her husband, could be treated as what they called a feme sole trader. Take in what that meant, because it is a genuine crack of daylight. For the purposes of her business, such a woman could act almost as if she were single. She could make contracts in her own name for the trade. She could sue those who owed her and be sued in turn as a trader in her own right. The law, so insistent everywhere else that she did not exist, made a practical exception at the shop door. Commerce, it turned out, was more persuasive than principle. So in the streets of London and a handful of other towns, you'd have found them. Married women running millinery shops, print businesses, taverns, all manner of trades, on their own account and under their own management. The doctrine of coverture said a wife was absorbed into her husband. The custom of the city said, for the sake of good business, let's not carry that too far. Both were the law. They simply disagreed, and the woman behind the counter lived in the space between them. It was a complicated map, this world of hers. It was a complicated map, this world of hers. Let's slow down and feel the shape of this whole picture, because we're nearing the quiet part of the night. The married woman of this age lived a double life, and not by choice. In one life, the legal one, she was covered, suspended, folded away, a person the law could barely bring itself to see. In the other life, the lived one, she managed money, directed households, bought and sold, made 1,000 decisions a day, and held real authority that everyone around her recognized. She was, at once, invisible and indispensable, and she carried both of those truths through every ordinary day, the way you carry things you've stopped noticing you carry. There's one more silence worth naming, though, before we let the day go soft. For all her daily authority, there were rooms where her voice was simply not allowed. The courtroom was one. In general, a wife could not testify against her husband. Their legal oneness meant her word and his could not be set against each other as two separate voices. She could not stand up and speak as a witness the way a stranger could. That rule, like so much else tonight, was dressed as protection. A wife should not be forced to condemn her own husband, the reasoning went, and perhaps sometimes that was a mercy. But it also meant that in the very moments when her testimony might have mattered most, her voice was once again folded away. Even her power to speak the truth in court ran through the fact of her marriage. So there she is, the whole of her, as our evening draws down toward rest. Legally covered, yet daily powerful. Silenced in the courtroom, yet trusted in every shop on the street. Denied her wages, yet holding the keys to the whole household. A contradiction wearing a muslin gown, moving through her ordinary day, entirely herself, and legally almost no one at all. That is the woman we've spent tonight coming to know. Not a victim exactly, and not free either. Something more human as more interesting than either word allows. A person who lived, fully and cleverly, inside a set of rules designed to make her disappear. Before we let the day go dark, let's simply walk through one of her ordinary days. Not the law of it, the feel of it. From the first grey light at the window to the last candle guttering at the bedside. Come with me, quietly, and let the rules fade into the background where, for her, they mostly lived anyway. It begins in near darkness. The room is cold, the way rooms were cold then, with a chill that sits in the air and waits for you. Somewhere below, a servant is already up, coaxing the first fire of the day back to life from last night's embers. You hear it before you feel it, the scrape of the grate, the small complaint of kindling catching, and then, slowly, the first thread of warmth climbing the stairs. She rises into that cold. There's water in a basin, cool against the face, sharp enough to wake her fully. There are clothes to be managed layer upon layer, in an order as fixed as a prayer. None of it hurried. The day has its rhythm, and the rhythm is old. She moves inside it the way you move through the rooms of a house you've lived in for years, without thinking, without needing to look. Downstairs the household is stirring into its long day of small tasks, and here, from the very first hour she is in command of it. The fires, the meals, the marketing, the endless quiet negotiation of a house full of people and needs. The law upstairs may say she owns nothing. Down here, among the warm bread and the account books, nobody has told the day that. The day answers to her. There is breakfast, simple and warm. Tea kept under lock and measured out by her own hand because it is precious. Bread, butter, perhaps something more if the household runs to it. The smell of it fills the room, ordinary and comforting, the smell of a day beginning as thousands had begun before it. You know that smell, even now, across all the years. Warmth and bread and the first hot drink of the morning. Some comforts do not change at all. Then the real work of the morning. The keys come into their own. Stores are checked and doled out. The cook is spoken with. Decisions are made, dozens of them, each one small. All of them together the difference between a house that runs well and one that falls into muddle. She carries the whole map of the household in her head. What is low? What is needed? What can wait? What cannot? Somewhere in the morning there may be marketing to do or tradesmen to receive. And here, remember, she spends with an authority the law pretends she does not have. The butcher knows her. The draper knows her. Her word is good, her judgment trusted, her husband's credit quietly standing behind every order she gives. She moves through the little economy of the neighbourhood as a person of consequence, whatever the statute books say about her. The middle of the day is quieter. Perhaps there is needlework, that endless soft labour of women's hands, mending and making and the slow patient repair of a household's cloth. Perhaps there is a letter to write. Ink and paper, the scratch of the pen, that same small sound we heard at the very beginning of tonight when she signed her name away. The pen in her hand now writes gentler things, news to a sister, a word to a friend, the ordinary threads that held a life together across distance. The light shifts through the windows as the afternoon wears on. If there are children, they move through the day like small weather, needing, asking, learning, filling the rooms with noise and then mercifully with quiet. She oversees it all, the whole tender chaos of it, holding in her mind 100 things that no one will ever write down or thank her for. This is the labour that left no legal trace, the running of a life, the keeping of a world. And slowly the day begins to fold toward evening. The light goes gold, then grey, then soft. The fires are built up again against the coming cold. Candles are lit, one by one, small flames pushing back the dark. In a way we can barely imagine now, we who banish night with the touch of a switch. For her, the darkness was real, and the light was precious, and the evening was lit by flames she could count. Supper comes and goes, the house grows still, the servants finish their work and withdraw. The children are settled, and at last there is a pause, the day's work mostly done, a little quiet carved out before sleep. Perhaps she sits by the fire in that last hour. Perhaps there is a book, or the needlework again, or simply the flames to watch. The house ticks and settles around her, the way old houses do, letting go of the day's warmth board by board. Her hands, busy since before dawn, are finally still in her lap, and whatever the law said about who she was, in this hour, in this chair, by this fire, she is simply herself, a person at the end of a long day, tired and warm and entirely real. This was the shape of it, not the drama of courtrooms and settlements, though those were real too, just this, a woman moving through her days with skill and patience and quiet authority, inside a world that had decided on paper that she was hardly there at all. She knew better. The fire knew better. The keys at her waist knew better. And the pen, still resting in its stand, its ink long dry, knew better than anything. Because that same pen had written her out of the law on her wedding day, and that same pen, every day since, had written her back into the world, one letter, one list, one small good decision at a time, and she was not alone in that world. All around her, softly, were other women, living other versions of the same story. Let's drift among them for a while, gently, before the night closes in. There's no hurry now. The hard part of our journey is behind us. What's left is just the quiet looking. Think of her unmarried sister if she had one, the woman who never took those vows and so never vanished. In law, she stayed a feme soul all her life, a whole person, able to own and sign and keep and choose. We tend to pity the spinster of these old stories, the aunt in the corner, the maiden sister passed over. But hold that picture up to the light of everything we've learned tonight, and it turns a little, because that unmarried sister kept something her married sister had given away, her legal self. If she had money of her own, it stayed her own. If she earned, she kept it. If she wished to leave her small fortune to a friend, she could, with no one's permission but her own. She answered to no husband. The very independence that marriage dissolved, she simply never let go of. It was a lonelier road, often, and a harder one for money, and the world could be unkind to a woman who did not marry. Let's not pretend otherwise. But it was not the empty life we sometimes imagine. In its own quiet way, it was one of the freest lives a woman of this age could live. The sister in the corner may have understood something the bride did not yet know. Then there is the widow we met a little while ago, further down the same street, in her own house, running her own affairs, and the servant girls in the kitchens, unmarried and legally whole, though poor and worked hard, and the great lady in the manor house, and the laundress at the river, and the shopkeeper's wife behind her counter. A whole world of women, each one standing at a slightly different point on the same strange map of belonging to oneself or not. What binds them all together is that none of them were simply the helpless creatures the law's cold language might suggest. Every one of them found her own way to live, to matter, to hold some ground that was truly hers. The rules were the same harsh rules for all. The lives lived inside those rules were as varied and as full and as stubbornly human as lives have ever been. That's the thing I most want you to carry with you into sleep tonight. Not the harshness of the law. You'll forget the details of that by morning, and it doesn't matter if you do. What's worth keeping is the picture of the women themselves. Clever, capable, patient, funny, tired, loving. Real people, moving through real days, entirely present in a world that had decided to look right through them. They were here. That's what stays with me. For all the law's insistence that a married woman was hardly there at all, she was here, as solidly and warmly here as you are right now, wherever you're resting. She woke and worked and worried and loved and slept. She was as real as the fire in her grate and the keys at her waist. More real in the end than any word a lawyer ever wrote about her. And here's the gentlest truth of the whole night, the one to fall asleep on. She never knew we'd be thinking of her. She never imagined that someone, centuries later in a world she couldn't have dreamed, would lie in the dark and wonder what her days were like. She lived entirely inside her own time, sure that it was the only time there was, and yet here we are, quietly keeping her company across all those years. She is not gone, not entirely, not while we remember. So let the details fall away now, the settlements and the statutes, the courts and the careful, clever workarounds. Let them dissolve like the last of the daylight. They've done their work. They brought us here, to this quiet place, to the simple fact of her and of you. Two people separated by 200 years and joined just for tonight by a little act of attention in the dark. The house she lived in is long gone, most likely, or changed past knowing. The fire she tended is cold. The pen she wrote with is dust, but something of her remains, carried forward the way all these small human things are carried forward, hand to hand, voice to voice, until it reaches you here, now, at the end of your own long day. There's a kind of comfort in that, I think, as the night deepens, that nothing warm is ever entirely lost. A life lived well, quietly, without any expectation of being remembered, can still send its warmth down the long corridor of time. It can reach a stranger, settle over them like a blanket exactly when they need it most. She would not have understood a word of how you're hearing this, but I think she would have understood the kindness in it. One person, at the end of the day, keeping another gentle company as the light goes down. That she knew. That never needed any law at all. The evening is nearly still now. The story has told itself out the way stories do, winding down of their own accord toward quiet. There's not much left to say, and that's exactly as it should be. The facts are all behind us. What remains is only the warmth they leave. So let's stop walking now, you and I. We've come a long way tonight, through parlours and courtrooms and kitchens and the longed, ordinary days of a woman's life. Your part in the journey is nearly done. From here, there's nothing left to do but rest. Let the room come back around you, the real room, the one you're actually lying in. Let the history soften into the background, a gentle murmur, no longer asking anything of you. You don't need to follow anymore. You don't need to remember. You only need to stay here a little longer, unhurried, while the last of the story settles. Let's go back one more time to the beginning of it all. To that cool parlour on a wedding morning, where a woman stood at a plain table with a pen in her hand. Do you remember it? The inkwell, the single sheet of paper, the quill, freshly cut. It feels like a long time ago now, and in a way it was. We've lived a whole life since then, hers and a little of our own. She's still there, if you let yourself see her, standing in the pale morning light, her name half written on the page, the ink catching the light as it dries, going from wet and bright to soft and matte. Such a small thing, that drying ink, and yet the whole of tonight was folded inside it, a person disappearing and quietly refusing to. Let the image hold gently, the candle nearby, though it's morning, lit against the early grey, its small flame steady in the still air, the warm smell of the wax, the faint curl of smoke when it's finally pinned out between two fingers. These are the things that were real to her, not the law. The law was somewhere far off, in a book on a shelf in a city she might never visit. This was real, the candle, the ink, the morning. And all through the years of her marriage, that same quiet furniture of daily life stayed close to her. The writing desk with its shallow drawer, the pen returned each evening to its stand, the candle carried from room to room, casting her shadow large and soft on the walls as she moved through the darkening house. Light and ink and paper and warmth, the small, constant companions of a life. There's something restful in returning to them now, the way you return to familiar things at the end of a long day. We don't need any new facts. We've had enough of those to last a good while. Now we can simply rest in the images, let them move slowly through the mind, the way pictures do when you're almost, but not quite, asleep. The fire in the grate, settling lower. The keys, set down at last on a table by the door. The muslin gown, brushed and folded, put away in its chest with a sprig of something sweet to keep the moths off. The letter finished and sealed, waiting for morning. the house breathing out its warmth into the cold night, board by board, room by room, and the woman herself wherever she is in this last soft picture. By the fire, perhaps, her hands finally still, or already climbing the stairs by candlelight, one hand cupped around the flame to keep it from guttering, her shadow rising ahead of her along the wall, going up to bed, as you will soon, or already have, carrying her small light through the dark toward a rest. It's a good image to hold, I think, as the night grows deep. A single candle moving through an old house held by a woman the law could barely see, who was nonetheless as real and as warm as any person who ever lived. The flame doesn't argue with the darkness. It simply keeps burning, small and steady, lighting the next step and the next. That's all any of them could do, really. All any of us can do. Keep the small light burning. Move gently through the dark. Tend the fire. Mind the flame. Carry it carefully up the stairs at the end of the day. The law is loud, and history is loud, and the world is loud. But a candle in a dark house asks for none of that. It just gives its quiet light and lets the night be soft around it. So let her carry her candle up the stairs and let yourself grow heavier and warmer as she goes. There's nowhere else you need to be tonight. Nothing else you need to do. The whole long story has brought you here, to this quiet, to this warmth, to the simple flame moving slowly through the dark. Stay with it a moment longer. The light is enough. The warmth is enough. You're exactly where you're meant to be. The candle burning low, the house going quiet, the night settling softly all around you. And still that small flame burns, up the stairs now at the edge of a room, beside a bed not so unlike your own. The same darkness she knew is the darkness around you now. The same rest she was moving toward is the rest that's moving toward you. 200 years apart, and the end of the day is the end of the day. The candle burns, the house is quiet, and sleep, that oldest and gentlest of companions, is settling over you both. And as the flame burns low, one last small thing drifts back to me. Something we passed by, earlier, without quite stopping. It's about her name. Stay with me for it. It's a soft thing, and it belongs here, at the quiet end. On that wedding morning, she didn't only sign away her legal self. Something happened to her name, too. By the custom of the age, she took her husband's surname as her own. The name she'd carried since birth. Her father's name. The name her mother had called across the yard when she was small, folded quietly away. That much you might have guessed. But it went further, in ways that reach right to the heart of tonight. In the polite world, a married woman was often addressed by her husband's name entirely. Not just his surname, his first name too. She might become, in a letter or an introduction, Mrs., followed by his Christian name and a family name together. Turn that over gently in the last of the light. Her own first name, the most personal word she owned, the sound her mother chose for her before she could speak. It could slip out of public use altogether. In the formal world she was named for him, twice over. His name, wrapped around hers, until hers could no longer be seen. It's the covering again, isn't it? The same quiet folding away we've watched all night, reaching now into the most intimate thing of all. Not her money this time, not her property, her name, the first gift she was ever given, the word that meant her and no one else. And yet, even here, something survived. This is the part to hold as you drift. Because the law could reshape her public name, but it could never quite reach the private one. To her mother she was always her first name, plain and dear to the very end. To her sister, to the friends she'd had since girlhood, to an old servant who'd known her since she was small. In their mouths, in their letters, in the soft shorthand of people who love you, she stayed simply herself. The name the world had folded away lived on, whispered in the places where affection kept it warm. A person can be covered in law and still be perfectly, completely known by the people who matter. She was. They knew her. They called her by her name. There's a deep comfort in that, I think, as everything grows still, that the most official kind of erasing, the kind written in law books and letters and formal address, never quite touches the realest thing. The self your loved ones know, the name spoken in tenderness, that lives somewhere the law was never able to go. It's true for her 200 years back, folded into her husband's name and yet held, always, in the private names of those who loved her. And it's true for you tonight, whoever you are under whatever name the world has given you. The paperwork version of a person is never the whole of them. There's always a truer name underneath, the one that only love bothers to learn. So let her keep her private name, safe in the mouths of the people who loved her, and let yourself be for tonight. Not any official version of you, not the name on your documents, just the you that rests here now, warm under the blankets, known and safe, whatever any paper says. The candle has burned lower still. The room around her and the room around you have gone soft at the edges. This is the hour when the day finally loosens its grip, when the tasks are done and the accounts are closed, and there's nothing left to manage or decide. The keys are set down, the pen is at rest, the fire is banked for the night. She would have known this hour well. Everyone does. It's the oldest hour there is, the same in every century. The hour when a person, having done all they can do, simply stops and lets the darkness be kind. She reached it every night of her life, just as you're reaching it now, the work put down, the body heavy, the mind beginning at last to wander loose, and her days, remember, were full ones. She rose in the cold and worked until the light was gone. She carried a whole household in her head, its needs and its people, and its 1,000 small demands. By the time this hour came, she had earned it, the way you've earned yours, the deep plain rest that comes after a day truly lived. So there's a kinship in it, across all that distance. Two tired people, 200 years apart, arriving at the same quiet shore at the end of the day, setting down the same invisible weight, turning at last toward the same soft dark. She rests, and you rest, and the resting is the same resting it has always been, since the very first person lay down at the end of the very first long day. Let that kinship hold you now. You're not alone in the dark tonight. You're in the oldest company there is. Everyone who ever lived came in the end to this same hour and laid themselves down and let the day go. She did. They all did. And now, gently, it's your turn. There's nothing left to understand. The story is told. The facts have all been given, and you're free to forget every one of them. They were never the point, not really. The point was only ever this: to keep you gentle company for a little while, in the dark, at the end of your day. To sit with you the way someone once sat by a low fire 2 centuries ago, while the light burned down and the night came on. And now that's done too. The company's been kept, the story's been told. All that's left is the rest itself, and you're almost there. Let's put the old house to bed together, slowly, the way she would have. There's gentleness in those last small rituals, and they'll carry us the rest of the way down. First, the fire. Not put out, never quite out, but banked. the glowing coals raked together and covered over with ash, so a little warmth would survive the night and be coaxed back at dawn. A house was never allowed to go fully cold. Somewhere in it, always, a small heat was kept alive in the dark, waiting for morning. There's something tender in that when you think of it. Even asleep, the house kept one ember breathing. Then the doors, a last quiet walk through the ground floor, checking the latches, feeling the cool draught at the thresholds. The house pulled in around itself for the night, shut against the cold and the dark, safe, sealed, a warm hollow of a place, with its people gathered sleeping inside it, and the whole wide night held at bay beyond the walls. Upstairs the bed itself was made ready, and here's a small comfort you and I have mostly forgotten. On a cold night, a bed was warmed before you climbed into it. A metal pan filled with embers from that same fire was passed slowly between the cold sheets, chasing the chill from the linen, so that when a tired body finally slid beneath the covers, it met not a cold shock, but a spreading, waiting warmth. Imagine that for yourself now, if it helps. Sheets already warm, the cold pushed out ahead of you. That first moment of lying down into warmth, when the whole body understands all at once that the day is over and rest has finally come. She knew that moment. You know it too. It hasn't changed in 200 years, that pure animal relief of a warm bed at the end of a long cold day. Around the bed, perhaps curtains, heavy hangings that could be drawn on their rings, closing the sleeper into a small, dark, private room within the room. A pocket of warmth and quiet, sealed off from the draughts and the dark. Inside them, the world shrank to the size of the bed. Just you, and the warmth, and the soft dark, and nothing else at all. Outside, the night went on without her. In a town, a watchman might pass in the street below, his footsteps slow on the stones. He called the hours as he went, and told the sleeping town that all was well, a voice in the dark keeping its lonely round, so that everyone else could let go and sleep. You have your own versions of that now. The hum of something far off, the sense, half felt, that the world is being minded while you rest. She would have heard those footsteps fade, and known she was safe, and let herself sink down at last. The day's long list finally silent in her mind, the keys still, the accounts closed, the children breathing softly in their own beds down the passage. Nothing left undone that couldn't wait for morning. That's the permission we all wait for, at the end of the day, the sense that it's finally all right to stop, and it is all right to stop now. That's what this hour is for. Everything you are carrying today, you can set down, the way she set down her keys. It will all still be there tomorrow, and you'll be stronger for having rested, but not now. Now there's nothing to carry. Now there's only the warm bed, and the soft dark, and the slow, easy loosening of a body letting go. The house is quiet around you. The fire is banked low. The doors are latched, the curtains drawn, the night safely shut outside. Everyone who needs minding is minded. Everything that needed doing is done, or near enough, and you, at the centre of it all, are warm and safe, and finally, wonderfully allowed to rest. Let your body grow heavy against the bed. Feel how it's held completely, needing nothing from you now. There's no effort left to make, no thought left to finish. The day has closed gently, like a hand relaxing open, and you're sinking slowly into the soft dark that's been waiting for you all along. We've come to the very end of our walking now. From here the path leads only down, gently, into sleep. So let me lower my voice, and slow my words, and simply stay beside you a little longer as you go. If you forget everything else from tonight, Forget it freely. The laws, the names, the clever arrangements, let them all drift away. There's only one thing underneath it worth keeping, and it's a soft one. It's this. A person is always more than the world's record of them. She was. You are. That's the whole of it, really. Everything else was just the long way round to saying so. She lived her whole life inside rules that tried to make her small, and she was never small. Not for one single day. She was as wide and deep and real as any life has ever been. The law wrote one thing. The truth was always something larger and warmer, and quietly beyond its reach. And so are you. Whatever this day asked of you, whatever it took, whatever went unfinished or unseen, none of it is the measure of you. You are more than any of it. You always were. Let that be the thought that carries you down tonight. Because right now in this room, there is nothing you need to be. No name to answer to, no task to hold. No one needs anything from you here. There is only you and the dark and the warmth and the slow settling of a day that's finally completely done. Feel the bed beneath you now, holding all your weight. Notice how little you have to do. The mattress takes you completely and asks for nothing back. Your head is heavy on the pillow, your arms are heavy, your legs heavy and warm, sinking down into the softness. Let your shoulders drop if they haven't already. Let your jaw loosen. Let the small muscles around your eyes go soft and still. There's a warmth spreading through you now, slow and easy. The warmth of a body finally allowed to rest. It moves down from your face, through your chest, along your arms, all the way to your fingertips. Nothing to hold, nothing to carry. Just the warm weight of you, held safe in the dark. And somewhere in that softening dark, one last image, quiet and warm. The ink drying on the paper by candlelight. Let it come back to you slowly. The plain table, the single sheet, the candle beside it, its small flame steady and gold, and the ink, freshly written, catching the light as it dries. Going slowly from wet and bright to soft and still, the letters settling into the page, the shine fading gently to matte. Watch it dry in the warm circle of candlelight. There's no hurry, just the ink and the flame and the quiet. The small gold light wavering softly, the paper going still beneath the drying ink. Warm, golden, slow. Let that little pool of candlelight widen until it's the whole of the room, a small warm room in an old house, at the end of the day. The candle on the table, the ink drying on the page, and everything beyond the light, soft and dark and safe. You're there now, in that warm circle. You can rest there. It's been waiting for you all along. And your breath, somewhere in all that warmth, has been slowing on its own. You don't need to change it. Just notice it, moving quietly in and out like something gentle at the edge of sleep. In and out, slow and soft. The breath knows the way from here. It always has. Let it find its own easy pace. Nothing to do. Nothing to hold. Just the slow tide of it, rising and falling, carrying you down a little further with each breath. In and out, softer each time. The candle still burning, the ink dry now and still. The warm room holding you close. The candle burning low. The page quiet in the gold light. Everything soft, everything still. The candle, the warmth, the dark. Rest now. You're safe. The day is done. Let it all go soft. The light burns low. Sleep well.